The Dakota wind carried 3 sounds that night: the howl of a coming blizzard, the rattle of a dying woman's last breath in a lonely cabin, and the thud of a body falling against her door. Abigail Thorne, a widow barely a month into her grief, knew the first 2 sounds intimately. The third, heavy and desperate, was a sound that would either be her damnation or her salvation. She gripped the cold iron of her late husband's rifle, peering through a crack in the door at the blood-soaked man collapsed on her porch. A warrior of the sun dancers, the very people her neighbors feared more than God himself. Lowering the rifle was madness. Opening the door was a death sentence. She did both. The blizzard screamed across the Black Hills, a physical manifestation of the emptiness that had hollowed out Abigail Thorne's world. It had been 37 days since she'd buried her husband Franklin on the little rise overlooking their homestead. 37 days of silence, punctuated only by the wind's mournful cry and the creak of the cabin's timbers settling into a lonely future. The cold wasn't just in the air, it was a permanent frost on her soul. Franklin had been her bedrock, a man of quiet strength and calloused hands who had carved this life from the unforgiving soil. A sudden fever, swift and merciless, had taken him, leaving Abigail with a half-ploughed field, a dwindling supply of firewood, and a grief so vast it felt like its own territory on a map. Tonight the storm was a monster, clawing at the cabin, seeking entry through every chink in the logs. Abigail sat by the meager fire, a worn shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, Franklin's rifle resting across her lap. It was more a companion than a weapon, now a tangible piece of him she couldn't bear to put away. The firelight danced across the rough-hewn walls, casting long, wavering shadows that twisted into spectres of memory. She saw him in the armchair he'd built, his head tilted back in exhaustion. She saw him by the hearth, mending a harness, the scent of leather and sweat filling the small space. Each flicker of the flames was a fresh stab of loss. That's when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A heavy, wet thump against the front door, followed by a groan that was swallowed almost immediately by the wind. Her heart leaped into her throat. Her knuckles turned white on the rifle's stock. Her first thought was a wolf or perhaps a bear driven down from the high country by the weather. But animals didn't groan like that. It was the sound of a man broken and in pain. Out here, miles from the nearest settlement of Deadwood Gulch, a visitor at this hour in this storm could only mean trouble. It could be a road agent, a claim jumper, or worse. The tales told in town were rife with violence, of men who preyed on the isolated and the vulnerable, and a widow alone was the most vulnerable of all. She rose silently, her moccasins making no sound on the wooden floorboards. She crept to the window, her breath fogging the cold glass. Wiping it clear with the sleeve of her dress, she peered into the swirling vortex of white. For a moment, she saw nothing but the frantic dance of snow. Then, a dark shape resolved itself on her porch, a crumpled heap at the base of the door. It was a man. Even in the gloom, she could see the fringed leather of his leggings and the dark, wet stain spreading from his side, melting the snow beneath him into a slurry of crimson. He was one of them, one of the sun dancers, a warrior. The people of the plains, whose very name was a whispered curse in Deadwood Gulch, a byword for savage raids and brutal warfare. The army at Fort Meade told stories to make children cower in their beds, and the settlers embellished them with their own fears. Every instinct screamed at her to back away from the door, to douse the lamp and sit in the dark until morning, praying he would be gone or dead. Helping him was unthinkable. If he lived, he might kill her for her supplies. If he died on her property, his people might come seeking vengeance. And if anyone from the town especially Deputy Marshal Hiram Finch ever found out she'd harbored one, she'd be branded a traitor, an outcast. They might even string her up. Hiram, a man whose piety was as thin as cheap varnish over his cruel ambition, would see to it personally. He'd already been circling her property like a vulture, making offers for her land that sounded more like threats, his eyes lingering on her with a possessive gleam that made her skin crawl. She pressed her forehead against the door, the cold wood a shock to her skin. The wind howled, and through it she heard another sound, a faint, ragged exhalation, a sound of life desperately clinging on. She thought of Franklin, his chest rattling with that final, awful breath. She thought of the promises they had made to God and to each other, to be decent, to be human, even when the world was not. What was she, if she let a man die on her doorstep, no matter who he was? What was this life Franklin had died for, if it was built on a foundation of such cowardly fear? Her decision was not a thought, but a feeling, a sudden rebellious surge against the cold, the fear and the crushing weight of her grief. She was alone. Yes, but she was not yet a ghost. With a trembling hand, she unlatched the heavy bar. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it open against the cabin wall. Snow and icy air flooded the room, extinguishing the lamp and sending embers from the hearth skittering across the floor. The warrior caught in the sudden draught rolled slightly, his face turning towards the dim firelight. His eyes were closed, his features contorted in pain. A gash ran along his temple, his long black hair matted with blood. But it was the wound in his side that was killing him. A dark, ugly puncture, likely from a cavalry bullet, oozing blood that steamed in the frigid air. He was younger than her 26 years, with a strong jaw and high cheekbones that spoke of a proud lineage. He was an enemy, the face of the wildness her people had come to conquer. But in that moment, stripped of his weapons and his strength, he was just a dying man. Abigail wrestled the door shut against the storm's fury, the bar falling back into place with a deafening thud. The cabin was plunged into near darkness, the only light coming from the dying coals. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of terror and resolve. "God forgive me," she whispered into the gloom. Gritting her teeth against the strain, she grabbed the warrior under his arms. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She dragged him inch by agonizing inch away from the door and onto the bearskin rug before the hearth. His body left a bloody trail on her floorboards, a stain she knew might never wash out. It was the first mark of many her choice would leave upon her life. As she stoked the fire back to life, the flames illuminated the man on her floor, and the impossible, terrifying road she had just chosen to walk. The first 3 days were a waking nightmare, a blur of blood-boiled water and whispered prayers. The warrior, whose name she didn't know and couldn't ask, drifted in and out of consciousness, a fever raging through his body. Abigail worked with a frantic, desperate energy she hadn't felt since Franklin first fell ill. She tore strips from her own linen bedsheets for bandages, the finest thing she owned, and used the last of Franklin's whiskey to clean the wound. It was a deep, ragged hole in his side, inflamed and angry. The bullet was still inside. She knew with a sinking heart that she had to get it out. She had helped the town doctor Alistair Finch Hiram's older, kinder brother once, when a miner had his leg crushed. She remembered the grim set of his jaw, the way he'd sterilized his tools in boiling water and poured liquor down the man's throat. Summoning that memory, she laid out her tools on the hearth, her sharpest skinning knife and a pair of Franklin's pliers, both scrubbed clean and sitting in a pot of roiling water. When the warrior's eyes fluttered open, lucid for a brief moment, she knelt beside him. He stared at her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, pain, and deep-seated suspicion. He was weak, but the warrior's spirit was still there, coiling in his gaze like a cornered snake. She held up the whiskey bottle, then pointed to his wound. She didn't know his language, and he surely knew none of hers. But pain was universal. He seemed to understand. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. As she brought the bottle to his lips, his hand shot out surprisingly fast and gripped her wrist. His touch was not violent, but it was iron-strong, a warning. He was assessing her, searching her face for deceit. She met his gaze without flinching her expression, steady, trying to convey an honesty she prayed he could see. After a long, tense moment, his fingers relaxed. He took a long swallow of the whiskey, hissing as it burned its way down. The work was brutal. She gave him a piece of leather to bite down on, and as she probed the wound with the heated tip of the knife, his body arched in agony, a strangled cry tearing from his throat. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mingling with tears of pity and fear. She could feel the hard nub of lead deep in the muscle. Holding her breath, she clamped the pliers onto it and pulled. The sound of metal scraping against bone was sickening. With a final wrenching twist, the bullet came free. He went limp, passing out from the shock and pain. Shaking, Abigail cleaned and packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and crushed leaves, herbs her own mother had taught her to use. She stitched it closed with her finest needle and thread her stitches small and neat, as if mending a torn garment instead of a torn man. For days he was her secret shadow, a silent, breathing presence that filled the lonely cabin. The world outside ceased to exist beyond the swirling snow. Her life shrank to the dimensions of that small room, to the rhythm of his breathing, the heat of his fever, and the constant gnawing fear of discovery. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the chimney sent a spike of adrenaline through her. On the fourth day, the blizzard broke. The sun, pale and watery, illuminated a world transformed, buried under a pristine blanket of white. The beauty of it was terrifying. The snow recorded everything, her tracks to the well, the smoke from her chimney, all signs of life that could draw unwanted attention. And attention came that very afternoon. She was stirring a thin rabbit stew when a sharp rap echoed on the door. It wasn't the hesitant knock of a lost traveler. It was the confident, arrogant summons of the law. Peeking through the window, her blood ran cold. Deputy Marshal Hiram Finch sat atop his big roan horse, his partner, a nervous young deputy named Miller, beside him. Hiram's face was chapped red from the cold, and his pale eyes, small and hard as pebbles, scanned the cabin with an unnerving intensity. Abigail Thorne, he boomed his voice, muffled by the door. "Open up, official business." Panic seized her. The warrior was asleep on her bed, hidden behind a quilt she'd hung as a makeshift curtain. But the scent of her herbal poultice was in the air, and the bloody bandages were bundled near the hearth, ready to be burned. "Just a moment, Marshal," she called out, her voice trembling. She frantically shoved the bandages deep into the flames, praying the smoke wouldn't smell strange. She smoothed her dress and her hair, trying to erase the frantic worry from her face. When she opened the door, Hiram's eyes swept past her, cataloguing every detail of her cabin's interior. He dismounted with a proprietary air, as if he already owned the place. "Tough storm, ma'am," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Just doing a welfare check on the settlers in the outlying claims. Make sure no one froze to death." "I'm fine, Marshal." "As you can see," she replied, keeping her body framed in the doorway, trying to block his view. "You sure about that?" He took a step closer, forcing her to move back. "A woman all alone out here. It's not right. Not safe. We heard reports." Some of the sun dancers broke from the reservation before the storm. Army patrol had a skirmish with them up near Bear Butte. 1 or 2 of them got away wounded, they say. He paused, letting his words hang in the cold air. His gaze flickered towards the curtained-off bed. You haven't seen anything unusual, have you? Any strangers seeking shelter? No one would be foolish enough to be out in that blizzard, Marshal, she said, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. I've seen nothing but snow. Hiram sniffed the air. Smells medicinal in here. You feeling poorly, Abigail? Just some herbs for a chest cold, she lied, her mind racing. The damp air. He took another step inside his boots, heavy on the floorboards. He was testing her, pushing her. His eyes landed on the bearskin rug where she'd first laid the warrior. Though she had scrubbed it relentlessly, a faint dark stain remained deep in the fur. He stared at it for a long moment. From behind the curtain came a small sound, a soft moan, as the warrior shifted in his fevered sleep. Hiram's head snapped up, his eyes locking on the curtain. What was that? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. The house is settling, Abigail said quickly, moving to stand between him and the bed. The timbers always groan after a deep freeze. You know that? Hiram's gaze bore into her, searching for the lie. He wanted to believe her, or rather he wanted a reason to push further, to expose her and have her at his mercy. The air crackled with tension. The young Deputy Miller shifted uncomfortably on the porch, sensing the confrontation. Finally, with a smirk that was more of a sneer, Hiram backed away. Well, you take care of that cold. And remember my offer on this place. It's a generous one. This is no life for a grieving widow. A pretty thing like you belongs in town. He let his eyes trail down her body in a way that felt like a physical violation. He tipped his hat and turned to leave. If you see anything at all, you send word. We'll be paying a handsome bounty for any information on those renegades, dead or alive. Abigail watched them ride away, their dark shapes shrinking against the vast expanse of white. She leaned against the closed door, her legs giving way, and slid to the floor, gasping for breath. She had survived. They had survived. But she knew with a chilling certainty that Hiram Finch would be back. His suspicion was a seed, and in the fertile ground of his hatred and greed, it was bound to grow. In the weeks that followed Hiram's visit, a fragile routine formed within the cabin walls, an unspoken truce between 2 worlds. The warrior's fever broke, and with it the immediate danger of his death receded. He remained weak, but his eyes were now clear and sharp, missing nothing. He watched her constantly, his gaze an unnerving mix of gratitude, pride, and profound animal-like caution. Abigail gave him a name in her mind. Stoneheart, for the stoic, unyielding way he endured his pain without a single complaint. Communication was a slow, patient dance of gesture and inference. He would point to the water bucket, and she would fetch him a drink. She would hold up a potato, and he would nod or shake his head. She learned that the lines etched around his eyes deepened when he was in pain, and that a subtle softening of his jaw meant he was grateful. He in turn learned the cadence of her movements, the gentle way she tended the fire, the quiet hum that escaped her lips when she was mending clothes. One morning she awoke to find him sitting up his back against the wall, painstakingly working on a small piece of wood with her skinning knife. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his movements precise and economical. She watched him for a long time, the way the early light caught the sharp planes of his face. He was no longer just a patient, an enemy, a secret. He was a man, a craftsman, a quiet, formidable presence who had, without her realizing it, filled the suffocating emptiness of the cabin. As his strength returned, he refused to remain idle. One day, she struggled to lift a heavy log for the fire. Before she could try a second time, he was there, moving with a stiff grace. He took the log from her, his hand brushing hers for a fleeting second, and placed it on the fire with ease. He didn't look at her, but the message was clear: I am not helpless. From then on, he began to contribute. He saw that the axe handle was loose, and spent an afternoon meticulously tightening and securing it with strips of wet leather that dried to an iron-hard bond. He noticed the draft coming from a chink in the logs and silently packed it with mud and dried grass. He would take the scraps from her cooking, tie them to a string, and fashion a simple snare, returning from the edge of the woods with a rabbit or a grouse to add to their meager pot. He was a provider, his skills perfectly honed for this land that she was still struggling to understand. He was teaching her without words how to see the world through his eyes. He showed her which plants could be used for tea, which roots were edible, and how to read the subtle signs of animal tracks in the snow. She in turn left an old primer, a child's reading book, on the table. One evening she found him tracing the letters with his finger, a look of intense curiosity on his face. She sat beside him and said the word aloud, pointing to the picture. Apple. He watched her lips, then repeated the sound, his voice, a low, gravelly rumble, the first word he had spoken in her presence. Apple. A tentative bridge was being built, plank by fragile plank, across the chasm of their differences. One afternoon, as a thaw set in and the world dripped with melting snow, she was out by the small barn trying to mend a section of fence Franklin had never gotten to. It was heavy, frustrating work. A loose cow could ruin her garden, and the garden was her best hope for surviving the next winter. A post slipped, and the heavy rail crashed down, striking her arm. She cried out more in frustration than pain, sinking to her knees in the mud. Stoneheart was there in an instant. He knelt before her, his expression unreadable but intense. He gently took her arm, his fingers surprisingly soft, as he examined the dark, swelling bruise. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw something she hadn't seen before: a flicker of shared vulnerability, a recognition of the hardship they both faced in this place. He helped her up, and then turned to the fence. With an effortless strength that belied his recent injury, he hoisted the rail into place, using his body as a lever. He held it steady, then looked at her, a clear instruction in his eyes. She quickly hammered the nails to secure it. They worked together in perfect silent synchrony, two people bound by a strange and dangerous circumstance, yet finding a common purpose in the simple, urgent act of survival. When they were finished, he stood back, surveying their work. He then turned to her, and for the first time, the stern lines of his face softened into something that was almost a smile. He tapped his chest, then gestured to her, then to the sky and the land around them. He was speaking in a language of the soul, a language she was beginning to understand. He was telling her of a debt, not a debt of servitude, but a deeper, more profound obligation. A debt of blood paid back with kindness and protection. She had saved his life, and now in his world, his life was bound to hers. The fence was more than just repaired wood. It was the first payment, a symbol of a pact she had unknowingly made the night she opened her door to the storm. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the muddy yard, Abigail looked at the mended fence, at the quiet warrior standing beside her, and at the small cabin that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. The fear of Hiram Finch and the judgment of the world was still a cold knot in her stomach. But for the first time since Franklin's death, she did not feel entirely alone. She had a protector, an ally, a man whose silence spoke volumes, and whose honor she was beginning to realize ran deeper than any law written in a town magistrate's book. The arrival of spring was a quiet miracle. The last of the snow melted away, revealing the tender green shoots of new life on the prairie. The creek, which ran along the edge of Abigail's property, swelled with fresh water, its cheerful burble a stark contrast to the silence that had dominated the winter months. With the changing of the season came a change in the atmosphere within the cabin. The forced intimacy of winter began to feel like a cage, and the world outside beckoned. Stoneheart was fully healed. The wound in his side had closed into a puckered, angry scar, a permanent reminder of his brush with death. His strength had returned, and with it a restless energy. He spent more time outdoors, his eyes often scanning the horizon, looking for a sign, for a trace of his people. Abigail knew, with a growing ache in her chest, that he could not stay. He did not belong in her world of fences and deeds, and she could not hide him forever. Every passing rider, every distant plume of dust was a potential threat. The unspoken tension between them grew. The easy, silent companionship of their shared survival was now layered with the sadness of an impending farewell. There were moments when their eyes would meet across the small cabin, and the air would become thick with things they could not say. A strange and tender affection had taken root in the barren soil of their shared isolation, a feeling too dangerous to acknowledge and too powerful to ignore. One evening he did not return to the cabin for supper. As dusk bled into a purple twilight, Abigail's anxiety grew into a sharp-edged fear. She imagined him captured by Hiram or found by a cavalry patrol. She imagined him lying wounded again, alone in the wilderness. The realization of how deeply she had come to care for his well-being struck her with the force of a physical blow. She paced the cabin, her supper growing cold on the table, the rifle once again in her hands, though she no longer knew who the enemy was. He returned well after dark, slipping through the door as silently as a shadow. In his hands, he held a small, exquisitely carved bird, fashioned from a piece of cottonwood. Its wings were outstretched, as if in mid-flight. He had spent the day creating it, pouring his skill and his unspoken feelings into the delicate lines of the wood. He held it out to her. His face, illuminated by the firelight, was a mask of solemn emotion. "Oh, for you," he said, his English, still halting, pieced together from the children's primer and their brief lessons. "You keep." She took the bird, its surface smooth and warm beneath her trembling fingers. It was a gift of profound beauty, a piece of his soul made tangible. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He reached out not to touch her, but to gently trace the wing of the carved bird she held. "I go," he said softly. "Find my people." Abigail nodded, unable to speak, past the lump in her throat. She had known this moment was coming, had prepared herself for it. But the finality of his words was devastating. "It isn't safe for you here," she managed to say. "Hiram Finch. He won't stop looking." Stoneheart's eyes darkened at the mention of the deputy's name. He knew Finch was a threat not just to him, but to her. He had seen the way the man looked at her, the possessive hunger in his eyes. "He will not have this land," Stoneheart stated not as a question, but as a fact. He touched the scar on his side. "My life is yours. This place is yours. I will return." It was not a hopeful wish. It was a solemn vow, an unbreakable promise. In his culture, a life debt was a sacred bond, and his honor demanded he see it fulfilled. He saw her not just as a savior, but as a protector of his life, and by extension, he was now the protector of hers. He gathered his few things, the knife she had given him, a small pouch of her dried herbs. He stood at the door, a silhouette against the moonlit night. He turned back to look at her one last time, his gaze lingering on her face, memorizing it. There was a world of gratitude, of respect, and of a fierce protective tenderness in that final look. Then he was gone, melting back into the wilderness from which he had come, leaving behind only the carved bird, and a silence in the cabin that was deeper and more profound than any she had ever known. Abigail clutched the bird to her chest, the wood pressing into her palm. She was alone again, but something fundamental had shifted within her. The grief for Franklin remained a gentle scar on her heart, but it was no longer the all-consuming void it had been. In its place was a new and terrifying emotion, a fragile, dangerous hope. She was a settler's widow, a white woman on the edge of a hostile frontier. He was a warrior of the sun dancers, a renegade in the eyes of her law. Their worlds were at war, and yet he had promised to return. Standing in the doorway of her lonely cabin, Abigail watched the empty prairie and chose against all reason to believe him. The year that followed Stoneheart's departure was a slow, grinding trial by attrition. The fragile hope he had left behind was a tiny ember that Abigail struggled to keep alive against the relentless winds of hardship and hostility. Without his skills to supplement her own survival, became a starker, more desperate affair. The garden yielded less than she'd hoped, and the winter hunting was lean. But the true threat was not the land. It was the man who claimed to represent the law. Deputy Marshal Hiram Finch did not forget. His suspicion had festered into a poisonous obsession. He could not prove she had harbored a fugitive, but he was certain of it, and the thought of her defiance, her secret act of treason, gnawed at him. His visits to her homestead became more frequent, his thin veneer of concern peeling back to reveal the raw greed and malice beneath. He started with legal pressure. He arrived one day with a stack of papers from the land office, claiming there was a discrepancy in Franklin's original survey. A technicality, of course, he'd said with a slick smile, but one that could cause you a great deal of trouble. Might have to forfeit the claim. Of course, if you were to sell to me, I have the influence to make such problems disappear. Abigail, armed with a stubbornness inherited from a long line of pioneer women, traveled the 2 days to Deadwood Gulch. She spent a week navigating the frustrating bureaucracy of the territorial government, sleeping in the back of a livery stable and spending what little money she had to prove her claim was legal and sound. She returned exhausted, but triumphant, with a stamped document that validated her ownership. Hiram was furious. His next tactics were cruder. He spread rumors in town. Abigail Thorne was addled with grief, perhaps even mad. She was an Indian lover, a woman who had turned her back on her own kind. The whispers followed her on her rare trips for supplies. The storekeeper who had once been kind now served her with a clipped cold efficiency. Women who had offered condolences after Franklin's death now crossed the street to avoid her. She was an outcast, isolated by a wall of suspicion and fear. His psychological warfare escalated. One morning she found her well rope cut. Another time, the small cross on Franklin's grave was torn from the ground and thrown into the creek. They were petty, cruel acts designed to break her spirit, to make her feel so unsafe and alone that she would have no choice but to flee or sell. Each time she would methodically repair the damage, her resolve hardening like iron in a forge. Her defiance was quiet but absolute. This land was hers. It was Franklin's legacy, and now it was the place where she had saved a man's life. It was sacred ground. The harsh winter descended worse than the last. Abigail's supplies dwindled to almost nothing. She was skin and bones, subsisting on little more than boiled roots and weak tea. The loneliness was a physical ache, a constant companion in the cold, silent cabin. She would hold the small wooden bird Stoneheart had carved its smooth surface, a talisman against despair. She would repeat his promise to herself, in the dark, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I will return." But as the months dragged on, the words began to feel like a foolish prayer, the echo of a dream from another life. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. One bitter afternoon in late winter, Hiram Finch played his final card. He arrived not with legal papers or sneering words, but with 2 hired thugs, rough men from the mining camps, whose faces were maps of violence. "Abigail," he said, his voice devoid of any pretense of civility. "I'm done asking. I'm filing a formal motion of abandonment. This claim is clearly too much for a lone woman to handle. You're a danger to yourself. For your own good, I'm escorting you to town. This is my land," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She stood on her porch, Franklin's rifle held loosely in her hands. It was a pathetic bluff, and they all knew it. "That land is about to be mine," Hiram snarled. "Now you can come with me peacefully, or my associates can persuade you. Either way, you are leaving today." One of the thugs took a menacing step forward. Despair washed over Abigail. She had fought for so long, had endured so much. But this was the end. She was one woman against 3 men, against the corrupted law and the hatred of a whole town. Her shoulders slumped. The rifle felt impossibly heavy. The fight had gone out of her. And then she heard it. It started as a low, distant rumble, a vibration she felt in the frozen ground more than she heard with her ears. It sounded like far-away thunder, but the sky was a clear, merciless blue. Hiram and his men heard it too. They paused, turning their heads towards the east. The sound grew, resolving itself into the unmistakable earth-shaking rhythm of hundreds of galloping hoofbeats. Hiram's face went pale. He scrambled onto his horse, his eyes wide with a primal fear. Over the rise, a line of riders appeared, their forms stark against the winter sky. It was not a cavalry patrol or a posse. It was a nation on the move. Hundreds of warriors, their faces painted for war, their lances tipped with eagle feathers that fluttered in the wind. It was the sun dancers moving with the terrible, beautiful force of a natural disaster. They flowed over the prairie, an unstoppable river of men and horses, parting around her small cabin, as if it were a sacred stone in the middle of a current. They ignored Hiram and his men, completely their focus on some distant, urgent purpose. Abigail stood frozen on her porch, her heart seizing in her chest. She scanned the faces of the warriors, a sea of hard, unfamiliar men, and then she saw him. He rode at the very head of the column, not on a simple pony, but on a magnificent war horse decorated with symbols of honor and victory. He was not the wounded, desperate man she had known. He wore a full bonnet of eagle feathers that trailed down his back, a breastplate of polished bone, and an air of absolute authority that seemed to radiate from him. He was a chief. Her stone heart had become a leader of his people. He brought the entire column to a halt with a single raised hand. The thunder of hooves ceased, replaced by an unnerving silence, broken only by the snorting of horses and the jingle of harnesses. Thousands of dark, unblinking eyes were now fixed on the small cabin, on the 3 terrified white men, and on the lone woman standing on the porch. Stoneheart dismounted and walked towards her, his footsteps deliberate and confident in the snow. He stopped before Hiram Finch, who was trembling so badly he could barely hold his reins. Stoneheart looked from Hiram's terrified face to the rifle in Abigail's hands, and he understood everything in an instant. His expression, already hard as granite, became something far more dangerous. He did not speak to Hiram. He simply looked at him, a look of such profound contempt and authority that the deputy marshal seemed to shrink in his saddle. Then Stoneheart turned his back on him, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and walked to the foot of Abigail's porch. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the same man she had nursed back to health, the same soul who had carved her a bird in an act of silent devotion. The chief's regalia fell away, and for a moment they were simply two people who had found each other in a storm. "I have returned," he said, his voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent prairie. The world seemed to hold its breath. The prairie, which had been the stage for Hiram Finch's petty tyranny, was now the floor of a great theatre, and all eyes were on the players. Behind Stoneheart, hundreds of warriors sat on their horses, silent and watchful, their presence an overwhelming force that changed the very nature of the air, charging it with a raw, ancient power. Hiram and his hired men were frozen, their bluster and bravado evaporating into sheer terror. They were no longer the law, they were intruders, their authority rendered meaningless. Stoneheart's gaze remained locked on Abigail. He saw the thinness of her frame, the weary lines around her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago, and the defiant way she held the rifle. He saw a year of hardship and persecution in a single heart-stopping glance. A cold, protective fury settled deep in his chest. He took the final steps to her porch and gently, reverently took the heavy rifle from her hands, setting it aside. His touch was brief, but it sent a shock of warmth through her cold fingers. He then turned to face the assembly, his people and hers, and raised his voice to speak. He did not speak in his own tongue, but in the English he had painstakingly learned his words, deliberate and clear, intended for all to understand. "This woman," he began, his voice ringing with a chief's command, "is Winyan Kete, the life-saver. When I was left for dead shot by the soldiers' guns, and lost as the great blizzard, she took me in. She did not see an enemy. She saw a dying man. She gave me her warmth, her food, and her medicine. She faced down the law that hunts us, and lied to protect me. She spilled no blood, but she offered her own life for mine." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He then turned his piercing gaze back to Abigail. "In the way of my people," he declared, his voice dropping to a more personal, yet still resonant tone, "a life saved is a life owed. But the debt she is owed is greater than one man can repay. She has shown a courage that shames warriors, and an honor that shames chiefs. An act of such magnitude cannot be repaid with furs or horses. It must be answered with honor." He took a deep breath, preparing for the words that would irrevocably bind their fates together. "I, Stoneheart, chief of the Sun Dancers, claim this woman as my bride. I will take her as my wife before my people and before her own. Her home will be my home. Her enemies will be my enemies. This land which she defended with her spirit is now under my protection. The Sun Dancers protect their own." A collective gasp went through the small crowd of white men. Hiram's face, already pale, turned a sickly shade of grey. This was not a raid or a negotiation. It was a proclamation, a formal, cultural declaration that was as binding and sacred to the Sun Dancers as any Christian wedding vow. It was a political statement, a strategic move, and a deeply personal act all at once. By claiming Abigail Stoneheart was not just fulfilling a life debt. He was absorbing her and her land into the sphere of his tribe. He was drawing a new border, not on a map, but in the flesh and blood reality of the prairie. Abigail's mind reeled. Bridewife. The word seemed to come from a great distance. She had dreamed of his return, had prayed for it, but she had never imagined this. This was not a gentle proposal whispered in the moonlight. It was a public claiming a political maneuver executed with the precision of a battle plan. It was terrifying, and in a way she could barely admit to herself, breathtaking. She saw the logic in it, the cold, brilliant strategy. As his wife, she would be untouchable. No lawman, no government agent would dare move against the wife of the powerful chief of the Sun Dancers without provoking a full-scale war. He was not just offering her his heart. He was offering her the shield of his entire nation. From the ranks of the warriors, one rider urged his horse forward. He was older, his face a mask of grim lines, his war bonnet signifying his status as a respected elder and warrior. Abigail recognized him as one she'd heard settlers call Running Wolf, a man known for his fierce traditionalism and distrust of all outsiders. Our chief speaks of honor. Running Wolf called out his voice, sharp and challenging, speaking in their native tongue for all the tribe to hear. Stoneheart answered him in the same language, a rapid, guttural exchange that Abigail could not understand, but whose meaning was clear from the tension that flared between the two men. A murmur went through the assembled warriors. Running Wolf was voicing the concerns of many. To take a white woman, one of the people who had stolen their land and broken their treaties, was a dangerous, perhaps foolish act. She was an unknown, a potential weakness, a threat to the purity of their ways. Stoneheart listened patiently, his face impassive. When Running Wolf had finished, a heavy silence fell once more. The chief's authority was being publicly tested. How he responded would determine not only Abigail's fate, but his own standing as a leader. Stoneheart turned his back on Running Wolf and faced his people fully. He began to speak, his voice, now filled with a passionate fire, weaving a story for his tribe. He spoke of the blizzard of being weak and helpless. He spoke of the warmth of the fire, the taste of the broth she fed him, the gentle way she dressed his wound while he slept. He held up his hand and showed them the scar on his side, the mark of the white man's bullet. Then he pointed to Abigail and spoke of how she had stood against another white man, a man with a badge, and protected him with nothing but her own bravery. He wasn't just telling them a story. He was reminding them of their deepest values, courage, honor, and the sacredness of a life debt. He was painting Abigail not as an outsider, but as an embodiment of the virtues they held most dear. He finished his speech and turned his eyes once again, finding Abigail's. He had made his case to his people. Now the final choice was hers. He walked back to her, standing so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I've made my claim," he said, his voice, now a low, intimate rumble, meant only for her. "My words are true. I offer you my name, my protection, my life. But the choice must be yours. Will you come with me?" Abigail Thorne. She looked from his earnest, powerful face to the sea of warriors watching her, to the cowering form of Hiram Finch, and to the small cabin that had been her entire world. That world was gone. It had been a prison of grief and fear, and Stoneheart had just shattered its walls. To stay meant a life of persecution, of being an outcast forever. To go with him was to step into a world she could not imagine, a future that was terrifying, uncertain, and utterly unknown. It was a leap into the abyss. She looked into his eyes, and she saw the man who had repaired her fence, who had brought her rabbits for the pot, who had traced the letters in her primer with a gentle finger. She saw her protector, her silent companion, her friend. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will." A profound silence followed her answer. The word yes hung in the frigid air, a fragile yet unbreakable bond forged between two worlds. For a moment, no one moved. The Sundancers, Hiram Finch. Abigail herself all seemed frozen in the tableau of her monumental choice. Then Stoneheart smiled. It was not the brief, almost smile she had seen before, but a full, brilliant expression that transformed his stern features, crinkling the corners of his eyes, and revealing a warmth that felt as powerful as the midday sun. It was a smile of relief, of triumph, and of deep, undisguised affection. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers. His touch was no longer just a shock of warmth. It was an anchor in the swirling currents of her new reality. He turned to face Running Wolf, who still sat on his horse, his expression a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. Stoneheart didn't gloat. He simply stood with Abigail's hand in his, a silent declaration that she was now one of them, under his protection, and part of his heart. He raised their joined hands for all to see. Winyan-Katie has spoken, he called out to his people in their own language. She is now of the Sundancers. A great shout went up from the warriors. It was a sound of primal energy, a roar of approval and acceptance that rolled across the prairie and shook the very foundations of the small cabin. Whatever doubts Running Wolf had sowed were washed away in the tide of their chief's victory. They respected his strength, they honored his story, and now they accepted his choice. Running Wolf, seeing the will of the people, gave a stiff, formal nod. The challenge was over. The chief's word was law. Stoneheart released her hand and walked with purpose toward his warhorse. Another warrior led forward a second mount, a sturdy, spirited mare with a gentle eye. It was for her. As he helped her onto the horse, his hands strong and sure at her waist, she felt a dizzying sense of unreality. She, Abigail Thorne, a farmer's widow from Ohio, was being lifted onto a warrior's horse, preparing to ride away with a people her own society deemed savages. From his saddle, Hiram Finch watched his face, a mask of impotent rage. He had lost. He had lost the land. He had lost his power over Abigail. And he had been utterly humiliated before his men, and before the very people he despised. His hatred, now robbed of its target, curdled into a venomous threat. "This ain't over, Thorne," he spat, his voice shrill with fury. "You're a traitor to your own kind. The army will hear about this. They'll hunt you down like the animals you've joined." Stoneheart didn't even deign to look at him. He simply gave a quiet order to two of his warriors. They dismounted and walked toward Hiram and his thugs. They did not draw their knives or lift their lances. They simply took the reins of the men's horses and calmly, deliberately stripped them of their rifles and pistols, tossing the weapons into the snow. The act was carried out with a quiet, dismissive efficiency that was more insulting than any blow. They were being disarmed like children. "Go, Stoneheart," said his voice, flat and cold as ice. "Tell your army, tell your townsfolk, tell them that Abigail Thorne is now Abigail of the Sundancers. Tell them this land is under our watch. If any of you ever set foot here again, you will not be allowed to leave." Hiram, sputtering with rage but cowed by the 100 warriors watching his every move, yanked his reins and galloped away, his hired men scrambling after him. They fled not with the dignity of a retreat, but the panic of routed cowards. Abigail watched them go, feeling the last ties to her old life snap. She turned and took one final look at the cabin. It was more than a home. It was a cocoon from which she was now emerging. It held the ghost of her first love with Franklin and the memory of her secret with Stoneheart. It had been her prison and her sanctuary. Now it was just a small, lonely building on an empty prairie. Stoneheart saw the look on her face. He guided his horse next to hers. "You do not have to leave it all," he said gently. "Take what you must." She shook her head. "No, There is nothing there for me now but memories." She looked at him, her heart full of a terrifying and wonderful new feeling. "My life is with you." She did, however, have one request. She pointed to the small grassy rise where the simple wooden cross marked Franklin's grave. Stoneheart understood immediately. He dismounted and walked to the grave. He stood before it for a long moment, a silent gesture of respect, from one man to another, a warrior acknowledging the man whose legacy he was now in a way inheriting. Then he returned. With a final command, Stoneheart wheeled his horse around and started the great column moving once more. Abigail fell into place beside him, a position of honor at the chief's right hand. The earth began to tremble again as hundreds of horses moved as one flowing eastward toward the heart of their own lands. Abigail didn't look back. She fixed her eyes forward on the vast open horizon and the man riding beside her. The wind whipped her hair from its bun, and for the first time in over a year, she felt its touch, not as a mournful cry, but as a promise of freedom. The life ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges she couldn't even begin to imagine. She would have to learn a new language, new customs, a new way of being. She would be a stranger in a strange land, but she would not be alone. She was a settler's widow who had sheltered a wounded warrior. He had returned as a chief and taken her as his bride. This was not the end of her story. It was the explosive, impossible, and real beginning. And so Abigail rode away, not as a captive, but as a queen, leaving behind a world of rigid lines and silent judgment for one of boundless horizons and fierce loyalty. Her story isn't just a relic of the Old West. It's a testament to the incredible power of a single choice. It reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. That compassion can build bridges between the most divided worlds, and that love can blossom in the harshest of landscapes. The tale of the settler's widow and the Lakota chief is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of defiance are quiet acts of kindness, and the most profound destinies are the ones we dare to choose for ourselves. If this story of courage, conflict, and forbidden love resonated with you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates epic tales from the American frontier. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you don't miss our next journey into the heart of history. Thank you for listening.